Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society. You're all very welcome here this evening for the second day of the Hist250 celebrations. So throughout the week, we've had a broadening focus. So yesterday was university education and things very much within our own locale. And today we broaden this focus slightly to look at Ireland, British-Irish relations, and the future of this island. So we'll start immediately, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr Christopher Casan, who is a former debates convener of the Society, gold medalist, excellent orator, and all-round brilliant commentator on these issues. So please welcome with me Christopher Casan.
Thank you very much, Luke. I always feel that when you have a handheld mic like this, it feels like you're announcing the bingo in a sort of a local hall or something. So please excuse any televangelism. It's a great honor for me to be here tonight. As Luke said, I was a member of the Hist when I was in college, which is much longer ago than I would like it to be at this stage. And I was reminded, actually, thinking, coming in here, of the very first time that I ever spoke to the Society, which was in my Freshers' Week, when I was green and just up from Kerry, adjusting to life in college. And I was somewhat incensed by the events that I saw unfold in the Hist Freshers' Week debate. I thought everyone was overly full of themselves, elitist, exclusionary, and so on. And I gave a speech about the excessive self-importance of the Historical Society that a friend of mine later told me made her think that I was slightly insane. So I wonder what 18-year-old me would make of me standing up here 16 years later, moderating a discussion rather self-importantly titled "The Future of These Islands." But I actually think that that is one of the great things about the Hist and one of the great things about student societies, because while it is important to have perspective and not to be overly self-important, it is also important for us to take on the big issues. And you are never too young to think about the big issues in your society or in your nation. And one of the amazing things about the history of the Historical Society is that it has been asking the questions that we are asking tonight, i.e., what is the future for our island and the island alongside it? What is the future for our society for all 250 years of its existence? Members of the Society have participated on all sides in everything from the 1798 rebellion through the Act of Union, through Catholic emancipation, to the Home Rule struggle, to the War of Independence, and on both sides very vociferously at different times. And so the students of today are participating in quite an important and amazing history that, while at times might seem grandiose, is also perhaps the very essence of being a student in a university and the very essence of being a citizen in a nation, asking what is the future that we have for ourselves. So I'm very delighted to be joined this evening by four speakers to discuss these issues with me. First, who I'm going to invite up on stage, we have Matthew O'Toole, who is an MLA for the SDLP and a former civil servant in Downing Street. We have the author and commentator Martina Devlin. We have Rory Montgomery, who is former Second Secretary General of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And we have Dr Katy Hayward from Queen's University Belfast. Now, we thought that what would be most interesting in this discussion, and with the student speakers who are going to speak after our panel, would be to give everybody 5 minutes to sketch out their thoughts on the future of Ireland, the future of these islands together, as a sort of big blue sky thinking, what does the future hold for us? And after all four of our speakers have had their 5 minutes to introduce their thoughts on these issues, then we're going to have about 40 minutes of discussion. And after that, we're going to hear from 5 student speakers from here in Trinity who are going to offer their thoughts on the same issues that we've been discussing. So to speak first, I'm going to invite Matthew O'Toole to address the Society.
Thank you very much, Chris, and it's an absolute privilege to be here. I'm slightly dishevelled because I ran from Connolly Station And in fact, I intend to come on to the matter of all-Ireland transport infrastructure, because I think it's an interesting example of where hopefully the future of this island goes, whatever its constitutional future. But I guess I'd like to start by thanking Dr Chris Casan, Ursula, and everyone at the Hist for putting on this event, but also inviting me. It's an extraordinary privilege to be here. As Chris said, Trinity has always been at the centre of the debate when it comes to Irish life, the future of this island and its relationship with the island immediately to our east. And indeed, one of the most famous graduates of this college is someone I'm now acquainted with on a daily basis, and that's, of course, Lord Duncairn, Sir Edward Carson, who I pass every single day on my way into work, which is slightly strange because a little under 2 months ago I became a member of the Northern Ireland Assembly. So that brings me to why I'm here, and part of the reason I was so delighted to be asked to address you tonight is that I guess part of the reason why I'm here, part of the reason why the last few years has been interesting for me at a professional and personal sense, but I guess for all of us, has been the question of Ireland. And I don't just mean Ireland writ large in the broadest sense, I mean the word Ireland, the definition and redefinition of what the word Ireland means. And I'll come on to that in slightly more detail later on. But to give a little bit of my own potted history, as of January this year, I was co-opted into the Northern Ireland Assembly as an SDLP member of the Assembly for South Belfast. My predecessor and colleague Claire Hanna was elected to Westminster in the general election that took place in December. They needed someone to replace her, and I was that lucky person. But it's a great privilege. The institutions restarted on the 11th of January, which was also coincidentally the day I started. My timing isn't always that good. I hope it's a little better tonight. Prior to that, I spent the last couple of years writing, commentating largely, and working in the private sector. But before that, as Chris says, I was working in Number 10 as a civil servant and working on the Brexit process, largely in communications, both before and after the referendum of 2016. Before that, for a number of years, I worked at HM Treasury. And what does the word Ireland mean, and why is that important? Well, Ireland in the last 20 years has experienced an enormous change. Whenever the Good Friday Agreement was signed, I don't know whether it was before or after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, Dr Maurice Hayes, who many of you will know is an enormously important public figure, former civil servant from my hometown, actually, of Downpatrick in County Down, said that the triumph of the Good Friday Agreement was, in a sense, the separation of the nation from the state, and in a sense, the implanting of a degree of creative ambiguity around those two things. There is a nation named Ireland and a state named Ireland. In the previous iteration of the Irish Constitution, i.e. the one that came before the 1998 Good Friday Agreement and the referenda in both parts of Ireland that followed, had Ireland the nation and Ireland the state as precisely the same thing. That was disputed. Clearly that was disputed by Unionists in Northern Ireland, and it was in a sense an unrealised and possibly unrealisable ambition, certainly at that time, and had been accepted as such by most of the Southern political establishment for a long time. The Good Friday Agreement created an ambiguity around that meaning that was constructive and helpful, and helped cement a slightly different political dispensation in the North. But it also, I think, enabled a clarification of this state and its obligations towards the North, and in a sense helped it move forward into a slightly clearer idea of its own future. That constructive ambiguity really came to a shuddering halt from my perspective on the 24th of June 2016. I felt, though I was a British civil servant, I was an Irish citizen. In fact, I travelled with the Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister, on UK governmental business using my Irish passport, and I didn't see any ambiguity. In fact, just before I came on stage, I was reflecting with Rory Montgomery, who I think it was 2010 or 2011, Rory was in a much more rarefied position of Irish permanent representative to the European Union. I was a Treasury press officer, but I had a chat at about 4 in the morning in a lift whenever we had concluded annual budget negotiations, and I'm sure Rory's probably quite relieved that he's not conducting the annual budget negotiation, or the 7-year MFF budget negotiations this year. And we had a friendly, cordial chat. Rory inquired as to not my background in an intrusive sense, but my background as to where I came from in Northern Ireland. It was very friendly and interesting. I didn't see any contradiction then. I did see a contradiction on the 24th of June 2016. So that contradiction, the contradiction between the nation of Ireland and the state of Ireland is one that I think has been thrown into stark relief by Brexit. Where do we go from here? Well, I don't know, except I think, and I hope we'll explore a little bit more in our discussion, where we go is flexibility and generosity in terms of those definitions, and I hope functioning institutions in Northern Ireland. But as we perhaps approach a glide path towards a changed constitution in this island, I think we need to be extremely generous about how we define Ireland, create new forms of Irishness, and use those definitions to, I guess, build a new set of relationships with the island immediately to our east. With that, I'll conclude, and hopefully I will be slightly more concise in the panel discussion. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for fascinating reflections there on a question that has kind of been at the very heart of the Hist for all 250 years of what is Ireland and what is the nature of Ireland. And moving on to invite Martina Devlin to offer her thoughts to the audience.
So I'd like you all to take a leap of the imagination with me tonight. Actually, it's not even a leap. Just a big step, because it's all within the bounds of possibility. Imagine if there was a new constitutional configuration on the island of Ireland. Now, whether that's a unitary state or a federal arrangement or whatever, but something closer and more cooperative than the current setup. Under this new design, politicians elected in the north might well sit in Dáil Éireann. Suddenly, unionism is in a strong position, a much bigger fish in the Leinster House waters than the Westminster equivalent. Potentially, it's a partner in government with the power to advance its agenda. It's not impossible that the DUP and UUP would make common cause and structure themselves either formally or informally to increase the size of their grouping. Let's pause the imagination button now and deal with reality. We're knee-deep in government formation. Politics has thrown up 3 parties of roughly similar size, none of them large enough to govern either alone or by 2 of the 3 in partnership. Others are needed to make the parliamentary arithmetic work. Now, juxtapose this reality against our imaginative scenario. Unionist politicians could be a linchpin in putting together a formula for government. It must be acknowledged that unionism isn't keen right now to consider the part it might play in a reimagined Ireland. The status quo is always more appealing. But events are precipitating change, and there's a need to examine the political systems on both parts of the island, not for romantic green fields reasons, but because it's better to shape change rather than let the cards fall where they will. Maybe there could be a shared economy. Would that deliver better outcomes in health, education, jobs? Would it mean increased prosperity for all? Well, first though, we need to have conversations about the future. conversations matter. Where to have them? Well, I'd suggest within the framework of a citizens' assembly. Effectively, it's a highly structured discussion forum, a tried and tested mechanism to assess public attitudes towards proposals. This citizens' assembly would need to be all island and cross-community and put together, as far as possible, on a representative basis. And it would need to operate in conjunction with focused, government-led planning to implement any changes agreed by citizens. It's fascinating when we think that Ireland is a world leader in citizens' assemblies. Our political scientists fly around the world advising others on them. Let's use our own expertise. Some people try to dismiss citizens' assemblies as a trendy attempt to circumvent seemingly intractable political problems. On the contrary, they are participative democracy in action. And grassroots movements work. They help to affect change. We've seen it internationally with the climate justice movement, with a teenager called Greta Thunberg camping outside the Swedish Parliament and raising public awareness with her passionate activism. We've seen it closer to home with the Together for Yes campaign and with the marriage equality plebiscite. We need politicians, of course, to play their part, but as citizens, we can't leave everything up to them. Consider now the two versions of Ireland which developed post-partition. In the north, a socially conservative society took root, in some ways indistinguishable from the duller parts of England. Although, ironically, Belfast is where radical ideas about the United Irishmen were seeded. And in the Republic, another socially conservative society developed, a society where books were burned and where girls were put into Magdalen laundries. It's only in recent times that this part of Ireland has begun to achieve its potential. So let's talk. Let's reassure unionists about their very welcome and valued place in a reimagined Ireland. And let's have a citizens' assembly that discusses flags, anthems, national holidays, the Constitution, how you'd amalgamate health, education, the judiciary, the civil service, learning from best practice in each. Let's address people's fears. If British and Irish identities can coexist on an equal footing in Northern Ireland, and that's guaranteed under the Good Friday Agreement, surely similar protections to guarantee unionist culture can be framed within a reinvented Ireland. Let's find a way. Various conversations are happening, and we need to find a way of bringing them together. Why not through a citizens' assembly? Talking matters. It's how connections are forged. And you know what? Ulster might not always say no.
Thank you very much, Martina, for a fascinating call for a Citizens' Assembly to discuss all of the myriad of issues that we will have to discuss if we think about the possibilities of unifying this island. So I'm now going to call on Rory Montgomery to offer his thoughts.
Auditor, ladies and gentlemen of the College of Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real honour and pleasure to be here. I feel a bit of a fraud, to be honest, because I could see in the room many more distinguished former members of the Society than myself. I never got any higher than the post of librarian, but at least I was comforted to recall that nor did Edward Carson. I want to talk about Irish-British relations in a very telegraphic way, not about all aspects of Irish-British relations, obviously. There are so many, many dimensions which are much more important in a way, fundamentally, than the political and the institutional, the sporting, the cultural, the business, the human, but about the political and the institutional. And it's fair to say, though, that the relationship is not exactly, has never been an altogether easy or straightforward one. The great Anglo-Irish novelist Elizabeth Bowen, who once said that she only felt at home on the mailboat between Dún Laoghaire and Holyhead, she once said that the British-Irish relationship was, quote, a mixture of showing off and suspicion, nearly as bad as sex. Now, when I used that in a speech in my days of foreign affairs 25 years ago, the then head of our division then added a sentence about the equal mixture of pain and pleasure. But we won't follow that particular simile too far, perhaps. But it is a complicated relationship, no question about that. I mean, obviously, one fundamental factor which will change the relationship is the departure of Britain from the European Union. There have been two main things Irish and British governments have spoken about over the last 50 years. One has been Europe, and the other has been Northern Ireland. And as far as Europe is concerned, we don't know, of course, what the future relationship between the EU and the UK is going to be. I remain slightly optimistic that a rational deal will be done, but no question, even if that does happen, there will be a greater distance between Britain and the European Union, and thus between Britain and Ireland in some respects, than has been the case for a very long time. And the European Union without Britain will be a different kind of European Union. It remains to be seen to what extent Britain is a partner of the European Union, to what extent it becomes a rival to the European Union, or a mixture of both. It remains to be seen in this very complex geopolitical environment to what extent will the United Kingdom drift closer to the United States, and of course what will the United States be? Where will the European Union and the UK find themselves vis-à-vis China? There's a whole raft of really big questions. But there's no doubt that whatever the answers to those questions will be, and it'll take a long time to work out, that will profoundly change the relationship in a fundamental kind of way. And there is, of course, also, as Matthew was saying, we have lost this habit, we will have already lost this extraordinary interpenetration of connection between British and Irish ministers and civil servants and diplomats. I mean, I would have met so many people over my time in foreign affairs from the British government and from the Foreign Office and other departments with whom I would have established really good relationships and friendships. They are in all sorts of jobs now across the British system. One of them, even rather remarkably, who was my office's number back in about 2003, is now David Frost, who's now running the negotiations with Barnier. When he went off to head the Scotch Whisky Association, and after being in the Foreign Office, I think little would have been thought that he'd be back running this important negotiation, but there you are. So Brexit, anyway, has an enormous impact on the relationship. And then when it comes to Northern Ireland, the other thing we've talked about, and still fundamentally the most important question, which is of interest to the two governments together. Again, I'm not going to talk about how things might unfold, and we can talk about that later, and Martina has offered a vision. Suffice it to say that I suppose the pattern over many years has been that British governments have only felt it necessary to become interested in Ireland when they've absolutely had to. And as a rule, they have other more important, in their view, or more interesting things to do. Famously, before 1969, the same section of the Home Office which dealt with Northern Ireland also dealt with British summertime and the protection of wildlife. So I don't know if we'll get back to that, but certainly it's striking to see the extent to which people's memories in the British system are short. One felt when the Conservatives came in 2010 that they had never known what Good Friday actually really was about, and certainly I'm not sure that many of them learned it in the intervening period. So I think that is clearly a problem, and it's a fact of life. It's small countries and big countries who are the neighbours, there's always an inequality in the relationship. But it's going to be a real challenge. How do we keep Ireland in a way on the agenda? I suppose the ideal situation would be one in which there's a sufficient level of knowledge, but the situation is not bad enough to require that knowledge to be used. And how you actually maintain that connection or that balance, I'm not quite sure. Great work is done by officials, but also by many other people in civil society and the arts and so on, to maintain and to nourish British-Irish connections. And I mean, Hugo McNeill is here tonight, and I put in a plug for Hugo as a candidate for the Senate. Hugo McNeill is here tonight, is the president of the British-Irish Association, which does a tremendous amount of good work in this area. But there's no doubt about it. I've been involved in a lot of sort of formal British-Irish discussions on a range of matters, but if there's not real substance, then it's much harder to keep the momentum going. And Europe offered one part of that substance, Northern Ireland offers the other part. And there are important things we can do together otherwise, but they're inevitably second order. So that'll be a huge challenge to Irish diplomacy, to our enlarged embassy in London, to the enlarged British embassy in Dublin. It'll be a huge challenge to find structures which, if you like, mitigate the damage done by Britain's departure from the European Union. And that's all we can hope for. Many other things I look forward to talking about later, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rory, for raising the great looming island to our east, which of course always looms over the past and future of this island. And now I will offer Katy Hayward her opportunity to offer her thoughts.
Thank you very much. It's a great honour to be here, not least as a graduate of the University of Ulster and UCD even. I'd like to begin by reminding ourselves what's in the Declaration of Support for the Good Friday Agreement from the British and Irish governments that talks about the relationship between these islands, and it says, "We are committed to partnership, equality and mutual respect as the basis of relationships within Northern Ireland, between North and South, and between these islands." I don't know whether these are all currently in evidence at the moment, but the point I'd like to make to you in my 5 minutes is that this is not enough for the future. If we're trying to reflect on the future of these islands, one thing that we're very aware of is that change can happen at a bewildering pace. And most importantly, I think, one of the most outstanding lessons from recent years and experience in dynamics between these islands is that the inconceivable can happen. And it can happen very quickly too. So what do we need more than the principles of equality, partnership and mutual respect? Well, I want to reflect a little bit on an experience I had recently in Dresden, where I was over for an international congress and commemoration on the 75th anniversary of the bombing of the city. And the overriding theme, of course, and as you might expect, was never again. And many of the discussants who were from all around the world said the young generation needs to know that this should never, ever happen again. But it's not enough to simply say what happened or even why it happened. But we need to teach and explain what was done to try and prevent a reoccurrence. And I think now, of course, about the agreement generation, some of whom are in this room, the agreement generation North and South, the agreement generation between these islands. And I'm privileged enough to teach that agreement generation in Queen's. And for them, the conflict, for many of them anyway, the conflict was another generation's problem. They can take peace for granted, and rightly so in many ways. They are unclear on the compromise, the hard graft, the difficult decisions that arrived at the Good Friday Agreement that gave them that peace. And again, to some degree, that's understandable. But the reason I'm worried is because they're not necessarily clear on the key tenets of the Good Friday Agreement, or indeed what underpins it. So they're not necessarily clear about the institutions across the three strands. And as Rory's mentioned, this is clear in civil service too. But what are those institutions? That's not necessarily known. The right to be British, Irish, or both, is that known? And is explained why that exists? The importance of human rights. Why is that in the Good Friday Agreement? Parity of esteem. Underlining all of this and the momentum through the Good Friday Agreement is, of course, the commitment to achieving political ends through exclusively democratic and peaceful means. And what I want to focus on is that issue of the democratic principles, because these are under threat. And these principles are under threat globally, but also very, very close to home. We see the rise of populism close to home. And we see, too, the politics of impunity, by which I mean there's a sense of consequence-free promise-making, consequence-free or cost-free policy-making. And underlying all of this, there's a desperate need to be held to account, because in some ways we feel it's almost out of control. There's like a runaway train and we don't know how to stop it. And I think, therefore, particularly in Ireland at this particular point, we need to be able to teach and pass on something much more fundamental, i.e. the core principles of democracy, the importance of an independent judiciary, the importance of the freedom of the press, the importance of necessary parliamentary scrutiny and debate, the importance of academic freedom, which I very much value. Going into the future of these islands, we need to be aware of the fundamental things in the present that we take for granted, but too, actually, that we cherish and that we need to protect, and which all generations need to take collective ownership of before it is too late. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie, and thank you very much to all four of you. So we have about half an hour of discussion now, so I'm sure we'll have the future structure of a United Ireland sorted out by the end of this panel. As many of you have raised, we are at a quite extraordinary time in the history of this island and in the history of this island and its relationship with Britain. Northern Ireland is no longer a member of the European Union against the wishes of the majority of the people who live there. For the first time since the foundation of Northern Ireland, unionist parties do not hold a majority in electoral politics in Northern Ireland, and most recently a Republican Party that wants to have an Irish unity referendum within the next 5 years has recently won the largest number of votes in an Irish general election south of the border. So it's an extraordinary time, but it's also the end of 250 years of talking about issues of how this island should be organised. I was struck the other day when I saw an article about Elvis Costello and the author Lee Child receiving awards in London, or CBEs and OBEs, where Lee Child was asked his views on a United Ireland, and he said that he would very much welcome a United Ireland because it's hundreds of years overdue. And I was thinking, Northern Ireland, of course, this year only reaches its 100th birthday. But partition has gone so far into our minds that we don't think of the island being in two parts as something unusual, because it has become the normal way of doing things. And if I could ask, first of all, Matthew, you, as you said, been landed straight into a Stormont Assembly that has only recently been reopened from a previous life living and working in the British government, and you are, I suppose, a great example of one of those people who feels that what has happened with Brexit has fundamentally changed the way that Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland's relationship with the Republic exists. I wonder, just from a personal perspective, when you go into work every day and you see Edward Carson and you have to go and talk to your unionist colleagues and stuff, do you feel that they are also aware of that? Is that something that the unionist population of Northern Ireland is also aware of? Or in some ways, is it still a nationalist concern to think about the unity, the future possible unity of this country, or this nation?
So, in answer to that question, I think, yes, I clearly agree that Brexit has fundamentally altered the masonry, the architecture, any number of analogies of relationships on this island and relationships between this island and Britain. Inside Northern Ireland, I think there is a growing acknowledgement within different parts of unionism that Brexit is, on the whole, very bad for Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom. I'll make a kind of analytical point and then get on to, I guess, what I should be doing now, which is slightly more kind of party political points. But
you can leave the party politics out.
The analytical point, I guess, is that if you think about it from a I guess, a structural point of view, why is Brexit bad for unionism, in my view, within the context of the United Kingdom? Well, if you think about something, a reason why, a reason in favour of the UK, or a strong argument that unionism would have been the size and influence of the UK. Just the fact that it's a relatively big, although relatively significantly smaller and less powerful than it was, it's still a relatively big, large economy. If you think about an influential country in the world, if you think about one of their weaknesses, it's, well, Northern Ireland isn't in Britain, it's on a different island, and that's fundamentally, that geological fact has always been one of the things that's driven this contradiction. Well, think about Brexit. What does it do? It does two things. It weakens the first argument, because it weakens Britain. So the idea that Britain is a strong, influential economy, that's weakened. And it draws attention to the second. It weakens their strong argument, and it strengthens their weakness, which is that it draws attention to the fact that Northern Ireland is not in Britain, it's on a different island. So that's one analytical point. I think you are seeing within unionism people acknowledge that, not within the DUP. It has to be said, the DUP are still, and we saw it in the Assembly yesterday, the DUP are still stuck, I'm afraid, in this loop, and a tendency to, not a tendency, an unwillingness to acknowledge the problems of Brexit. The Agriculture Minister yesterday, the Agriculture Minister unwilling to acknowledge the enormous difficulty created by Northern Ireland farmers as a result of Brexit. But within unionism, there are shades. There are many, although not probably a majority, of unionist remainers who haven't become nationalists. They're not United Irelanders because they don't like Brexit, but they are acknowledging that it changes the structure. But the second quick point I would make is that going forward, and I was really interested to listen to what Martina said, and she said some very interesting things. What does it mean in terms of making an argument for a changed constitution on the island of Ireland? Well, it means that there is an increasing group of people in Northern Ireland, and Katy has written very persuasively about these people, who are not unionist or nationalist. The unionist majority within Northern Ireland has gone, but there doesn't seem to be yet a nationalist voting majority to replace it. It means that people who want to make an argument for constitutional change, and that would include people in my party, albeit in a different way to Sinn Féin, have to think about how those people feel about both identity but also their future.
That's a really interesting point, and you mentioned what Martina said there. Martina, I wonder if I could ask you kind of a similar version of the same question, which is that, as Matthew's pointed out, there are unionists, certain shades of unionists not represented by the DUP, whose connection to the union has certainly at least been shaken by Brexit and the fact that they realise that Northern Ireland's self-government has limits and that they're going to be disadvantaged in many ways economically and so on. And then there are also people who don't identify necessarily as unionist or nationalist, who may also be open to differences about the union and the future constitutional structure. You talked about a citizens' assembly, and I was really interested in the things that you mentioned that it would have to discuss, things like flags and the anthem and the name of the state and all of these kind of identity issues that those of us who have grown up on this side of the border take for granted as the symbols of Ireland, the flag, the harp, the anthem, the constitution, etc. How do you think that nationalists will feel about the kind of open-minded discussion that would be necessary in a citizens' assembly if those unionists and non-unionists, non-nationalists were to be able to participate in it openly? Do you think nationalists on both sides of the border or either side would be uncomfortable, or do you think that that's just something that nationalists were going to have to accept is the only route if they ever want to see what for so long they've been campaigning for?
Well, nationalism isn't a monolithic organisation any more than unionism is. There's Republican nationalism, there's constitutional nationalism. Unionism is moderate, union is die-hard British. So there are shades of opinion in all of them, and as you've said yourself, there's also a middle ground. People who perhaps weren't even born on the island of Ireland but make their home there now, and they're open to persuasion. And what will persuade them is economics, their financial well-being, the pound in their pocket, the euro in their purse. So that's how people will decide where their best interests lie. The other thing, though, is that You know, romantic ideas are all very well in the pub at 2 o'clock in the morning, but cold, hard facts are what motivate people. And there's some very interesting research being done, which surprised me as someone who grew up in the North and was told all through my education, and maybe you had it, Matthew, the British system is brilliant. These A-level things are just fabulous, and you're getting such a great education, you should be grateful. But in fact, Seamus McGuinness, who works with the ESRI, has done some research which has been peer-reviewed in the Cambridge Journal of Economics, which shows that 4 in 10 of the population in the North are educated to 3rd level, compared with 6 in 10 in the Republic. And another stat he came up with, again peer-reviewed, is that a child born today in the North has a life expectancy 1.6 years fewer than a child born in the Republic. So it's not a land of milk and honey. It's one of the poorer parts of, the British Isles. Now, the question of nationalism and nationalist symbols. It will be problematic for some people to surrender, but you know what? I voted to give up Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution, and it was a struggle, but I felt it was the right thing to do for the Good Friday Agreement. And people are pragmatic and reasonable. And you know what? Is the tricolour such a gorgeous flag? Is it? When you think that you could have a symbol with a harp on it, with a musical instrument, with a sign of culture. When you think that you could use the clatter ring with the crown as a gesture to unionism and the heart. There are all sorts of possibilities, and just because this has been the way it was for 100 years doesn't mean it's the way it has to be. And I think young people especially will be more open to surrendering something to gain something bigger.
It's a very interesting point, because if we think about if people had this type of debate in this university in 1920, they would have thought very differently about the future of these islands than we are thinking about it now. There would have been a very strong unionist majority in a lot of the university. But equally, if they'd had that debate 100 or 120 years previously, they would have had sort of hardcore United Irishman style nationalism as the guiding light of this university. So things are certainly not fixed in time at all.
If I could just say quickly, think of the Lambeg drum. I grew up with a sense of dread at the sound of that drum because of what it represented, and we had to stay in our homes. Actually, it's a wonderful, stirring sound. I would love all kids who are interested and who have the muscles to lift one, because it's a bruiser of a musical instrument, to have a go at playing this. If we can park what we've learned or what we've absorbed from our backgrounds and our communities and just think, what's best for moving us all forward? I think we'd make, great strides.
It's an interesting point you make. Somebody from Antrim recently said to me, who's from a unionist background, that they constantly regretted not having had the chance to play hurling when they were growing up, and they really hoped that their children had that opportunity. So it is interesting the way that these symbols interact with different things. But Rory, I wonder if I could ask you about something Martina said, which was, she was talking about the fact that, romance and symbols and everything only get us so far. At the end of the day, and perhaps especially for certain communities on this island, cold hard facts, the results of government policy and money matter a lot to the way that people will think about these things. And having worked in the Irish government in its relationships with the British government, I wonder if I could ask you a version of the question I was asking about the compromises that would have to be made, because there are symbolic compromises that would have to be made if we were to have discussions about the future unity of the country. But there are also a lot of financial and state compromises that might have to be made, in the sense that might cost this state a lot of money. There are a lot of decisions that would have to be made about public administration and so on. And I wonder, I know it's difficult as a former civil servant to talk about the civil service, but what do you think about the role that the Irish state might have in those discussions and that type of planning? Is it something that the Irish state is capable of doing or should do?
Well, thank you very much. No, it's a very interesting question because I'm involved myself in a couple of projects involving the future of Ireland. But it seems to me that we have to maybe, a bit of a reality check here. I wouldn't want to put a figure on when there might be a referendum on unity, and there'll be a referendum north and south. I personally would be surprised if the conditions exist within the next decade, but we'll see. So, I think we have not to get ahead of ourselves. I think it's very important these issues are discussed. I think the government finds itself in an awkward position in as much as we've seen when Leo Varadkar and Simon Coveney a couple of years ago, even in a rather innocuous way, talked about their aspiration to United Ireland. This caused a great deal of panic and shock, real or otherwise, on the part of the DUP. So I think the Irish government rightly believes that the priority now is to focus on making the current arrangements work. And I think that's what has to be the priority. But at the same time, we cannot let these longer-term questions go undiscussed. And nor can we let them be the province simply of those who are most ideologically committed to an early United Ireland. I think it's important that the entire state and society own these questions. So I think the government has to find a balance between, I don't think it would be productive at this point for the government to leap into a discussion, to publish a white paper, anything of that sort, but I think it is important that there be discussions. But you're quite right. I mean, it's not just a question of cash. I mean, there used to be the old slur that unionists were more interested in the half-crown than the crown. I don't think that was ever true. In part, I think there's questions of identity and belonging which really strongly outweigh purely economic questions. The economic questions are important too. But you're absolutely right. There's a plethora of questions. The whole question of the famous subvention, it's a very complicated question. The economic, obviously the South has done so much better economically than the North over the last 50 years. That would have been unimaginable. But at the same time, the standard of living in Northern Ireland in certain measures remains slightly higher than standards of living in the Republic when you take everything together. So you have to disentangle all of these effects. You have to make some assumptions about growth rates and whether the gap would narrow or widen in economic terms. So there's a huge amount of work to be done in analysing all of this. But the bottom line, I think, is that yes, the people of this state would have to accept that lots of things would be on the table. And first of all, again, I'm not quite so sanguine that people would willingly and quickly give up the tricolour or our own Levian. I mean, again, as Hugh often says, if you look at the fuss there is every year about Ireland's call before internationals, you'd have to wonder. And then you've got then you have the financial question, and I think almost certainly, it would almost certainly eventually cost the citizens of the state something for there to be a United Ireland. There will be very difficult debates, as you say, about do you level up or down standards of social provision, because the trouble is in some areas things are better. There's a better health service probably still in Northern Ireland despite all the problems, but higher social welfare payments here. There's a host of difficult questions. And then there are questions like the Commonwealth, many other difficult questions. And so I think people in this state would have to, and I'll finish by saying that one poll, I think at least taken a couple of years ago, showed that while there was a fairly strong majority of people in the Republic in favour of United Ireland, the number who, when asked if they would pay an extra 10% in taxes, the number fell very sharply. So I'm not saying, and I think it's pie in the sky. Well, not when this question was asked.
I think it was a slight majority.
I don't think so. I think it was about 30%.
Well, it would certainly, the fact remains we would have to
but my basic point
a referendum here as well.
Exactly, anyway, the basic point is this, that the state, there are lots of issues which we in the state at different levels have to face up to. The timing and the handling of that discussion is very important, but I think we shouldn't call people. There would be a real price to be paid, and I think people would have to decide ultimately. I agree with Martina. I'm sure if the opportunity arose, the majority of people in this state would support a United Ireland. But I'm just saying that it would not be quite so straightforward.
I think there's an interesting point there to ask Katy your thoughts on, which is Rory was talking about the priority for the state and these constitutional issues. Of course, if there's perhaps one thing that we've seen from the Brexit referendum that is relevant to these questions for us, it's that having a referendum where the outcome is perhaps not planned by the state can end up as a disaster. Because if you have a campaign group who wants massive constitutional change to which the state has not planned, and then that side wins, the state is then basically left in the chaos that the British administration has perhaps been for the last 3 years. So while the state obviously has to make the existing arrangements in Northern Ireland work and has put enormous effort, along with some in the British government, at getting the institutions up and running, from your perspective, which you mentioned the fact that many people probably even through the 3 years didn't realise what the Good Friday Agreement said. You spent a lot of time trying to educate people in Britain about how Northern Ireland works over the last 3 years. How do you feel that the constitutional questions should be handled in this kind of debate? Because if not planning at all from a public perspective is not an option, and taking active sides throws up all sorts of other issues, is there a possible middle ground there that the state can take?
Okay, that's a big question. I think first and foremost, so I'm involved in a project that Trinity's involved in as well on thinking about unification referendums on the island of Ireland. And I have to say, the more we look into it, the more complicated it seems. And just for example, so one of the members of the working group is an expert on referendums, and he came up with 63 different scenarios for referendums, doing north and south, and what the type of referendum. Would it be a referendum on the principle of unification? Would it be a referendum on being able to start talks about unification and planning? Would it be a referendum on the final outcome, like a preferendum, for example, if that's possible to get a voting system for? So it's extraordinarily complicated. And I think there's a tendency to think about these things as we think of in a referendum terms, in a binary sense, that it's a simple solution, and it sort of resolves things. And of course, as you're pointing out, it really does not. And I don't think Northern Ireland is nowhere ready for a referendum. And all the evidence, like the reliable evidence, suggests that rather than thinking about unionism as losing its majority, we need to acknowledge the soft unionism that exists. So the proportion of Catholics who are effectively soft unionists, the fact that those neither unionist nor nationalist, most of them are effectively soft unionists. Now, absolutely that can change, and we have seen if you like, an earthquake under Northern Ireland, caused primarily by Brexit. And so these things are up in the air, but we cannot imagine that a border poll, for example, will be a simple solution. Northern Ireland is not ready for a border poll, neither is Ireland. Absolutely not. And if we look at in the change to Article 3, unifying Ireland in the diversity of its identities and traditions, I mean, Ireland is diverse now, and how much does Ireland's constitution reflect that? We were talking earlier about the political system. How much does Ireland's political representative system reflect the diversity that exists in Ireland? How much does its symbols, as Martina was saying? So Ireland itself needs to have these kind of conversations, actually, even before we get to the point of thinking how Britishness in Ireland's history, with all the horrendous stuff that goes alongside that, as well as all the more grandiose things. But how does Britishness feature in Ireland's history and Ireland's narrative about itself? And one thing that I would say is, the Good Friday Agreement about British, Irish, or both, it included in that this sense of Britishness is not partitioned into Northern Ireland. And one thing that's been made very clear through Brexit actually is the closeness of those ties, what British-Irish means. And of course, British almost means more to Ireland. Well, in fact, it does mean more to Ireland than Irish means to Britain.
They don't notice us the way we notice them. Yeah.
So those, this is a ripe opportunity to have those kind of conversations and think, well, what would Britishness mean in Ireland's system? I'm not particularly advocating one thing or another, but I am thinking, before we can even think that economics would win unionist round, I doubt that, but we'll see. Those kind of conversations need to be held quite openly, and people are trying to do that here as well.
That's, I think, a really interesting point. And you mentioned the diversity of Ireland now, because that's something that obviously has fundamentally changed since partition 100 years ago, which is that we have a much more diverse society on all sides of the island, but a diversity that I think points to something quite, perhaps an opportunity. And I wonder if I could ask Matthew about this in terms of you are an elected, well, appointed.
Someone was elected at one
someone
point.
Someone was elected.
I have
you
their mandate. It's mine now.
You are a legislator
Yes.
for a nationalist party. And nationalism has gone through, as Martina very importantly pointed out, nationalism is not a monolith now, and nor has it ever been. But there's a famous speech given to the Hist in 1840 by Thomas Davis, who was president of the Hist at that time, about which was considered quite shocking to some nationalists at the time, saying that the Irish nation didn't depend on race or creed, which I think is a line that I think about often now when I think of nationalism in a more diverse society. You are a representative of a nationalist party, and so these questions about what types of discussions we're going to have and what types of platforms that they might involve and so on, for you are also an issue of party politics. And without inviting you to take a soapbox, I wonder from that perspective, what approach do you feel that political nationalists should take in this debate? Because advocating for United Ireland is one thing, but advocating for a particular type of a United Ireland or advocating for a particular type of debate about a United Ireland is actually quite a different thing, a less romantic, more practical, and something that, as Katy pointed out, might have 60 or more possible outcomes.
Yes, and it should be the latter, I think. And I mean, there are several bits to that. I think the first thing to say is the party that I represent is, yes, it is a constitutional Irish nationalist party, but it's also a social democratic and Labour party. It's also the party which is, it's a strange now being on a soapbox, it is a party which has provided a lot of the intellectual, philosophical, and indeed sort of moral underpinnings of what became the Good Friday process. So, it's sort of in our DNA to be thinking about these structures. It isn't kind of, so instinctive, sort of revanchist Irish nationalism is not really certainly what I'm about, and it's not going to win anyone over. I mean, I agree with a lot of what everyone said, and a lot of what Katy said is very true about the complexity of the debate that is happening. But I just want to make a few points, and I'm answering. In doing so, I will answer your question.
Good.
The first is that the Good Friday process and the peace process that came afterwards, and in a sense the architecture of those institutions, it kind of offers us a roadmap forward, whatever happens. But it also has tended to allow us to think, particularly in the North, that it's all just up to us. And it actually isn't entirely just up to us. It is true that, in a sense, the Good Friday process was about kind of finding an accommodation between the two communities in Northern Ireland, and then reframing on top of that institutions across the islands. But it was about finding a place for nationalists within Northern Ireland while accommodating unionism to a new position. Well, actually, the change that's brought about the new debate is not change in Northern Ireland, it's change in England. It's change in Scotland. It's not that we don't have it is true that Northern Ireland might not be ready for a lot of this, but Northern Ireland might not have a choice in confronting these changes. It's not, in a sense, it's not all about Northern Ireland, and sometimes we take a while to learn that. But then the next point I want to make is actually really to go back to, I think, part of the reason why I've, moved back across this side of the Irish Sea, and I'm proud to be kind of representing, as it were, is a couple of things. One, a couple of times people in this panel have done that thing that the European Union correctly did in the protocol, which is use the formulation Northern Ireland and Ireland, and it's a really important thing because it really gets to this difficulty. That formulation is never once used in the Good Friday Agreement. It says Ireland, North and South, and I'm not going to use the hideous word partitionist, but if we want to get into thinking about what Northern Ireland is and how this part of Ireland interacts with it, both parts of the island, we need to think not just about the Britishness of Unionists in Northern Ireland, but their Irishness too, and the complex added layers of Britishness and Irishness, not just in Northern Ireland, and Northern Irishness, I should say as well, not just in Northern Ireland, but in all parts of these islands, in all parts of this island. And I would hope that people down here, as it were, if I could use that loaded phrase, are willing to kind of come north and engage in that and sort of think about, not just think about Unionists in Northern Ireland as this kind of distant group of people who are British, and we signed a treaty saying they're British, and yes, they are British, and that's not a false consciousness. But they're also Irish, many of them. And that's something that needs to be engaged with as well. And I think understanding Belfast, and I'm now a Belfast representative, so if there are any inward investors and your staff are priced out of living in Dublin, it's a lot cheaper a couple of hours north in the train.
The train can be delayed.
And so I think that's really important. And then the third point I want to make, which just flows on from that, is in addition to kind of understanding that complexity of identity and people kind of being involved in the North and thinking about the North and not othering it, and not having a kind of, if I could be so bold, Northern Ireland and Ireland mindset because I think that language is not particularly helpful at times. The final thing I want to talk about is, if we are talking about how we move to a changed constitution, and yes, my party does believe in that, we have to think about what that actually means in practical terms, not just in identity terms and not just in financial terms, in terms of what are the policy challenges of the 21st century. So I spoke to a group of students from South Belfast today who were interested, and they asked me pretty direct questions about unity, and these weren't kind of kids from, if you like, kind of traditionally Republican backgrounds. They were from mixed backgrounds, and they were just sort of quite directly asking me about Irish unity and what I thought, and practical questions. A couple of quick points. I didn't mention transport and trail. How are we going to join our island up better in terms of rail links? How are we going to turn this one big carbon sink that's the island of Ireland into kind of those sorts of things? I think are really important that we start getting into the policy challenges and not just the traditional.
And those are some of the things that our student speakers in a moment are actually going to touch on, which will be great. But that's something that you said there I thought was really interesting about acknowledging the Irishness of people who consider themselves to be British. And I remember being a student here in the Hist, one of the events that I remember most was we had an event with the Reverend Ian Paisley coming down to speak to the society when I was in college. And I remember the sense of trepidation amongst many students who had grown up down here of meeting him and shaking his hand and going around the long library with him, so he wanted to see the Book of Kells and things that other tourists might want to see. And obviously, he didn't come down to Dublin to do public events very often. But a student asked him from the audience in the questions and answers session whether he felt himself to be Irish as well as British. This was in the chamber of the GMB. And I remember the collective intake of breath, especially from someone from the north who was sitting alongside me. And there was a great tension in the room, but the way he answered it was quite extraordinary, which is he just said, "Yes, of course." And I remember being slightly floored, but also chastened in the sense that, well, why was I floored? Because Edward Carson or any other, Trinity Unionist from a long time ago would not have denied their Irishness either. And that kind of imaginative leap that Martina talked about at the start of her remarks is something that those of us on this side of the border generally need to make. And I think that's why I'm so glad that the four of you have contributed in the way that you have tonight, because having discussions like this that raise these issues for the future is the only way that we can make those imaginative leaps to get beyond the things that have been built into our minds over centuries and certainly over the last century. So thank you to the four of you so much for your thoughts on the future of these islands. I think that we've provided a lot of food for thought, and I'm actually going to invite our student speakers now to come up and contribute to the debate.